The wealthy mocked the quiet mechanic for buying a burned, twisted wreck. They saw a joke, unaware those ashes concealed a stolen legacy worth millions in silence. If the powerful offered a fortune to buy your conscience, would you take it? Afternoon, Texas sun caught the dust motes dancing above a thick stack of final notice bills, casting long, heavy shadows across the workbench. Cole ignored the glaring red ink demanding payments he did not have. Instead, he leaned closer to the scarred wooden table, pressing his late mentor's appraisal loop to his right eye. Under the magnified glass, the intricate brass gears of a broken pocket watch came into sharp focus. The steady, calloused hands of a man who found peace. Only, in fixing what others had thrown away, he realigned a bent hairspring. He breathed in the familiar, comforting scent of old wood, rust, and machine oil. This cramped antique restoration shop was all he had left of the man who had pulled him out of the orphanage system. It was his sanctuary, but sanctuaries did not pay property taxes. He needed a lifeline, something forgotten that he could breathe life back into. That desperate hope was the only reason he packed his tools, locked the heavy front door, and drove his sputtering truck across town that evening. The Caldwell estate auction was a world away from Cole's quiet reality. The sprawling property was bathed in the harsh, glaring light of temporary halogen towers, illuminating a sea of luxury cars and manicured lawns. Inside the massive exhibition hall, the air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne, fine wine, and casual arrogance. Standing near the auction block, Claire Caldwell surveyed the room, with her arms crossed tightly over her tailored blazer. She possessed the cold, haughty elegance of someone who had never been told no, her gaze sweeping over the crowd from an elevated height. Beside her, Richard Sterling leaned in to whisper something, a calculating smirk playing on his face. As the family's financial advisor, Richard was eager to liquidate the estate's remaining clutter and secure his commission. They were moving through the lots with ruthless efficiency, auctioning off decades of history as if sweeping dust out the back door. Cole walked through the hall, his worn, grease-stained flannel shirt making him entirely invisible to the elite crowd brushing past him. He didn't care. His eyes were scanning the edges of the room, looking past the polished mahogany furniture and crystal chandeliers, searching for the cast-offs. He found it shoved into a dark corner, resting on a heavy metal dolly. It was the blackened, twisted husk of a European race car. Fire had consumed the paint, the leather, and most of the interior, leaving behind a skeletal nightmare of scorched aluminum and melted wiring. Several attendees walked by it, turning up their noses at the pungent smell of burnt metal, dismissing it as a worthless piece of junk only fit for a landfill. Cole stopped. He did not see a pile of trash. He stepped closer, pulling the loop from his pocket by pure instinct. He knelt on the polished concrete floor, ignoring the disapproving glances of a passing couple, and peered into the charred cavern of the driver's side. His eyes, trained to measure perfection down to the millimeter, caught an impossible detail. The pedal box, the heavy steel assembly holding the clutch and brake, was completely wrong. The distance from the seat mounts to the pedals was drastically shortened, the angle uniquely asymmetrical. A lesser mechanic would assume the intense heat of the fire had warped the frame, but Cole knew the difference between structural collapse and deliberate engineering. That heavy saw steeple had not bent. It had been meticulously, manually fabricated that way. It was a custom coach-built modification, designed specifically for a driver with a remarkably small physical stature. A quiet thrill shot through him. The history embedded in that single asymmetrical measurement meant this was no ordinary vehicle. Lot 42, the auctioneer's voice suddenly boomed through the speakers. A fire-damaged chassis, sold as is. Do we have an opening bid of 500? The room fell into a dull, murmuring silence. Claire Caldwell rolled her eyes, impatiently tapping her manicured fingers against her arm, clearly wanting the eyesore removed from her pristine hall. Richard let out a low chuckle, shaking his head at the blackened heap. Cole stood up. He reached into his pocket, wrapping his fingers around the thin roll of cash that represented his entire remaining livelihood. He raised his hand. The murmuring stopped. Every head in the vicinity turned. Claire's eyes narrowed as she looked down her nose at the young man in the faded flannel shirt. Richard's smirk widened into a look of absolute pity. The wealthy collectors in their bespoke suits exchanged amused, condescending glances. Laughter rippled through the immediate crowd, a chorus of mockery aimed directly at the quiet mechanic. "Fuel. You paid money for a pile of ashes?" An older gentleman in a tuxedo sneered loudly, prompting another wave of laughter from Richard and the surrounding elite. Cole did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, his expression utterly blank, absorbing the full weight of their ridicule without offering a single word in defense. The noise of their arrogance washed over him, completely detached from the quiet certainty burning in his chest. He held the auctioneer's gaze and nodded once. The gavel fell. The transaction was done. 2 hours later, the heavy metal door of Cole's shop rattled shut, sealing out the noise of the city. The space was dead quiet, save for the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights glaring down on the center of the room. The burnt chassis sat on the concrete floor, smelling of old fire and forgotten decades. Cole walked slowly up to the ruined machine. He reached out, his calloused fingertips gently brushing the first thick layer of soot off the distorted rim of the steering wheel. The ash crumbled away, soft as snow. "Those fools!" Cole muttered to the empty room, his voice barely a whisper above the hum of the lights. "They just sold a soul, and they didn't even know it." The quiet of the restoration shop felt entirely different now. It wasn't the silence of an empty, struggling business anymore. It was the heavy, expectant stillness of a tomb about to be opened. Wyatt didn't waste another second. He pulled down the rolling work lamps from the ceiling tracks, arranging them in a tight circle around the charred chassis. For the harsh, unforgiving glare of the fluorescent bulbs, the true extent of the damage was laid bare. His opponent wasn't a person tonight. It was time itself, baked into a hardened crust of carbon. One wrong move, one aggressive scrape with a wire brush, and he could obliterate the very history he was trying to save. He worked with the reverence of an archaeologist unearthing a fragile artifact. Using soft natural bristle brushes, dental picks, and a low-pressure air hose, he moved inch by agonizing inch over the blackened frame. The acrid smell of burnt rubber, rust, and sharp chemical solvents burned his nostrils, but his focus never wavered. As the thick layers of soot gave way, the true anatomy of the machine began to reveal itself. He focused his efforts on the driver's side floor pan. It wasn't fire damage that had pushed the heavy steel pedal box so close to the seat bracket. The thick metal had been masterfully cut, re-angled, and precision-welded. It was an ergonomic setup specifically tailored for someone with an incredibly short stature. A corporate manufacturing line wouldn't do that. That was the unmistakable mark of an individual creator adjusting the machine to fit their own body. Cole slid beneath the chassis on his mechanic's creeper, sweeping the beam of his penlight up into the cavern of the steering column. Tucked deep behind a cluster of fused wiring, the light caught the dull edge of something small. Carefully, using long surgical tweezers, he extracted it. It was a worn, silver St. Christopher medal. The edges were smoothed down, rubbed flat by the nervous friction of a thumb seeking comfort before a dangerous drive. It had been deliberately wired into the dark recesses of the dashboard, a private prayer hidden inside a machine built for speed. Cole stared at the small pendant resting in his calloused palm. This wasn't the plaything of an aloof oil tycoon. It belonged to someone who relied on faith and blistered hands. He needed a name. Every vintage coach-built chassis carried a data plate. Fire could melt the aluminum body panels to liquid, but the heavy-gauge brass or stainless steel ID tags usually survived, buried somewhere beneath the grime. He found it riveted low on the firewall, completely entombed in a hardened layer of carbonized oil. Cole set his magnifying loupe over his right eye and retrieved a tiny glass bottle of specialized conservation solvent from his locked cabinet. He applied 3 precise drops, letting the harsh chemical eat into the crust, then began lifting the debris away with a microfiber swab. It was a painstaking, agonizing process. Rubbing too hard would scratch the delicate stamping underneath and erase the truth forever. Drop by drop, swab by swab. First, the chassis designation emerged from the darkness. CG-044. Cole's breath hitched in his throat. The air in the shop seemed to freeze. He knew the registry of mid-century European race cars by heart. CG stood for the Crimson Ghost, a legendary prototype line that had supposedly been destroyed in a tragic factory fire before it could ever race. Caldwell family had claimed a massive insurance payout and used the lost engine schematics to build the foundation of their modern automotive empire. But it was the second line of text that made his blood run cold. Under the heading for Chief Engineer, the solvent cleared away the final smudge of black soot. The name deeply stamped into the steel was Maria Vargas, not Henry Caldwell. A team of highly paid corporate engineers the family always credited in their glossy museum brochures. A woman, an immigrant mechanic whose name had been completely wiped from the industry's legacy. Cole stepped back from the firewall, the chemical-soaked swab slipping from his fingers to hit the concrete floor. The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. The customized, shortened pedals, the cheap silver metal hidden for luck. The Caldwells hadn't just claimed a convenient insurance payout on an accident. Still in a masterpiece from a woman who had poured her soul into it, forced her out of the history books, and quite literally burned the evidence to cover their tracks. A cold, quiet fury settled over him. It was a heavy, suffocating anger directed at the arrogance of billionaires who berate the people who could buy history and erase the people who actually built it. People like his mentor, the people like him. Cole walked over to his grease-smudged laptop on the corner desk. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed the International Conservation Registry's secured database. He didn't hesitate. He entered the chassis number, the engineer's name, and uploaded the high-resolution macro photographs he had just taken of the data plate. He hit the submit key. For a fraction of a second, the shop was dead silent. Then, the laptop screen flashed a harsh, glaring red, signaling an immediate restricted access alert. Before Cole could even process the warning banner, the heavy, metallic ringing of the shop's landline shattered the dead of night. The harsh ringing of the shop's landline had eventually stopped somewhere around 3 in the morning, but the Sufgedrebzeprot hung heavy in the air long after the sun came up. Cole had not slept a wink. He was still standing by his workbench, his hands stained with carbon and solvent, when the crunch of expensive tires on the gravel driveway broke the quiet Texas morning. The black SUV idled just outside the glass storefront, casting a long, dark shadow over the entrance. The brass chime above the door rang out. Claire Caldwell stepped into the cramped antique shop, her heels clicking sharply against the scuffed wooden floorboards. She looked around with open disgust, her arms crossed tightly over her silk blouse, as if the dust itself might infect her. Behind her was Richard Sterling, carrying a slim leather folder and wearing the smooth, practiced smile of a man who solved expensive problems for a living. The small shop suddenly felt entirely deprived of oxygen. The air grew thick and oppressive, invaded by the scent of luxury cologne and raw, unyielding power. Richard did not bother with a polite greeting. He walked straight to the workbench, his eyes darting toward the open laptop and the partially cleaned metal data plate resting on a microfiber cloth. "Mr. Wyatt," Richard began, his voice a low, soothing hum designed to mask its inherent threat. "It seems your late-night research triggered a few automated alerts in the conservation community. Alerts that cause unnecessary confusion regarding our family's private property." Cole remained perfectly still. He did not offer them a chair. He did not offer a word of welcome. His absolute silence seemed to grate on Claire's nerves, chipping away at her haughty composure. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Richard," she snapped, stepping forward, so she was uncomfortably close to the workbench. He looked Cole up and down, taking in his faneable and tired eyes. "You bought a pile of scrap, Cole. You think you've stumbled onto a lottery ticket. We are here to cash you out." Richard opened the leather folder. He pulled out a thick, legally binding, non-disclosure agreement and laid it carefully over the stack of Cole's past-due utility bills and final notices. On top of the contract, he placed a pristine cashier's check. Cole looked down. The number printed on that heavy paper was astronomical. It was enough to pay off the shop's mounting debts 100 times over. It was a golden shield against the constant, grinding anxiety of poverty that had followed him since his earliest days in the orphanage. For a fleeting, agonizing heartbeat, the lonely boy inside him screamed to take the money, to secure the sanctuary his mentor had built, to finally be safe from the world's cruel uncertainties. Richard noticed the slight shift in Cole's posture. His calculating smile widened into something predatory. "Sign the paper, Cole. And over the data plate, and the remains of the chassis, and you never have to worry about a leaking roof or a foreclosure notice ever again. Refuse, and our legal team will bury this shack in injunctions until the bank locks your doors by the end of the month." Cole looked from the staggering number on the check to Claire's expectant, impatient face. They weren't just buying a vintage car, they were buying an execution. They were attempting to do to him exactly what they had done to Maria Vargas decades earlier, using their immense, suffocating wealth to crush anyone small enough to be erased. They didn't care about the genius of the machine or the sweat that went into it. They only cared about preserving their immaculate, fabricated legacy. The realization washed away his anxiety like cold water, leaving behind a hard, unyielding iron resolve. He understood the profound difference between surviving and living with dignity. Cole did not shout. He did not curse or throw them out. He simply picked up his appraisal loop, sliding it quietly into his shirt pocket, and met Claire's gaze with absolute, chilling calm. "The history isn't for sale," he said, his voice quiet and perfectly steady. The arrogant smirk vanished from Richard's face as if he had been slapped. Claire's posture stiffened, a flicker of genuine, unmasked panic breaking through her polished exterior. They were entirely accustomed to people negotiating, begging, or ultimately caving under the weight of their checkbook. They did not know what to do with a man who could not be bought. "Thea Dunn, you have until tomorrow morning to understand how big of a mistake you are making," Richard said, his voice finally dropping its friendly facade to reveal the pure venom underneath. He turned on his heel, ushering a visibly shaken Claire toward the exit. The door chime rang again, and the heavy SUV sped away, leaving a cloud of dry dust in its wake. The shop settled back into its profound, dusty silence. Viol stood alone at the workbench, looking down at the cashier's check bearing a massive number that could effortlessly save his entire life. Before his eyes slowly shifted to the blackened silver St. Christopher medal resting quietly in the shadows beside it. Cole reached across the scarred wood of his workbench. He did not pick up the silver medal resting in the shadows. Instead, his calloused fingers closed around the edge of the pristine cashier's check. For a man who had spent his entire life measuring the exact weight of physical things, the slip of paper felt incredibly light. He slid it across the table, pushing the staggering sum of money right back toward Richard Sterling's perfectly manicured hands. "What are you doing?" Claire Caldwell demanded, her voice cracking as the polished veneer of her aristocratic composure finally shattered. "You are a mechanic, Wyatt. You don't know what you're throwing away." Richard lunged forward, his hand desperately reaching for the open laptop, finally realizing the gravity of the quiet man's posture. But Cole was faster, and his mind was already made up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't offer a grand, dramatic speech. He simply moved his hand to the keyboard, looked Claire dead in the eyes, and firmly pressed the send key. A soft, satisfying chime echoed from the laptop speakers. The high-resolution macro photographs of the hidden data, the metallurgical analysis of the petals, and the historical chassis or chassis were instantly transmitted to the secure servers of the International Conservation Trust. In less than a second, a site that had stood for decades was completely dismantled. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's hand dropped to his side. Claire stared at the glowing screen, her face draining of color as she watched the automated confirmation banner appear. The fabricated legacy of the Caldwell family, the automotive empire built entirely on stolen genius, was over. They had nothing left to buy, and no one left to threaten. Without another word, Richard turned and walked out the door. Claire lingered for a fraction of a second, her arrogant posture crumbling into the humiliated slump of a woman who had just watched her family's pristine reputation burn to the ground. She turned and followed her advisor out into the morning heat. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within weeks, the Historical Society formally stripped the Caldwell name from the Crimson Ghost Registry, exposing the theft to the entire vintage collecting community. As the specialist who unearthed the truth, Cole was awarded a substantial authentication fee from the International Trust, securing the future of his small antique shop for good. But the money had never been his destination. Real work took him deep into dusty municipal archives, patiently tracing immigration records, old census data, and fragmented family trees. He had to find where Maria Vargas's bloodline had gone. It took nearly a month of quiet searching to track down a modest, working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The late afternoon sun bathed the small front porch in a warm golden glow as Cole walked up the cracked concrete steps. The young woman in faded blue nursing scrubs was sitting on a porch swing, looking exhausted after a long shift. She looked up, surprised and a little confused by the stranger in the flannel shirt standing in her yard. "Can I help you?" she asked. Cole nodded gently. He pulled a thick, heavy dossier from under his arm and stepped forward. "My name is Cole Wyatt," he said, his voice softer than it had been in weeks. "I'm a restoration specialist. Spent the last month looking for the descendants of a woman named Maria Vargas." The nurse blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "That was my grandmother. She passed away when I was little. But she was just a seamstress. Why would a specialist be looking for her?" Cole opened his hand. Resting in the center of his palm was the silver St. Christopher medal, meticulously cleaned, but still bearing the smoothed, worn edges from her grandmother's anxious thumb. "Your grandmother wasn't just a seamstress," Cole told her, stepping forward to hand over the medal and the heavy-bound dossier. "She was a brilliant engineer. She built something incredible, and the world is finally going to know her name." As the young woman looked down at the physical proof of her family's stolen greatness, her confusion slowly melted into overwhelming realization. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks as her fingers closed tightly around the silver medal. In the quiet sound of her weeping, Cole felt a deep, enduring warmth spread through his chest. The orphaned boy inside him, who had always desperately wanted to know the value of the things left behind, finally felt at peace. Later that evening, Cole returned to his shop. He locked the heavy front door and flipped the switch for the overhead fluorescent lights. They buzzed to life, casting a bright, familiar glow over his workbench. The space where the charred chassis had once sat was now entirely empty. He stood in the quiet room, listening to the silence of the city outside. A rare, genuine smile touched his lips. Somewhere out there, a forgotten grandmother had finally been returned to her rightful throne, and the truth, once buried in the ashes, was finally safe.